So first off, let's go through a bit of an agenda of what we're going to go through today. Obviously, the theme of today is Azure NetApp Files, so we're going to cover that in some detail. We're then going to dive into a bit of infrastructure as code and how the Azure NetApp Files integrates with a couple of options there. And we're then going to dive into a bit of a use case around Windows Virtual Desktop using Azure NetApp Files to provide the storage backend for profiles and things like that. However, we'll get into that in a bit more detail, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. Feel free to post into the chat window, and we'll review that as throughout the webinar, and we'll answer questions where needed, and then at the end we'll cover all those questions off if we haven't answered any. So first of all, a bit about us. So I'm Jack Tracy. I'm one of our cloud solutions architects. I'm also an Azure MVP. I run a use group down in Brighton for Azure as well, and I've been dealing with Azure pretty much since its inception back in the good old Silverlight Portal days. So typical DC/infrastructure background, and use NetApp on-prem heavily throughout that section of my career.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Anthony Mashford. Like Jack, I'm a cloud solutions architect here at CDW, focused on Azure. Been working in the industry now for just over 20 years, and the last 8 of that have actually been focused within the Microsoft cloud.
Fantastic. So just a bit of a brief background on CDW if you don't know us already. So we're one of the world's largest value-added resellers, and we did 16.2 billion in 2018. Globally as a number, we employ around 9,000 people, and about 4,500 of those are all in service roles. Over the UK, and our coverage is pretty substantial. You know, we've got offices all over the world. Capabilities in professional services and delivery and shipping in all of those areas. Breaking that down into the UK, we've got 4 places of presence where we do a good majority of our work from. So London being our headquarters, with Peterborough being our service operation centre, where a lot of our service operation staff maintained and delivered services to customers. And then we've got our warehouse in Rugby, where all of our stuff is configured and shipped, with a regional headquarters based in Manchester and some other offices on there like Basingstoke and Birmingham that are not listed. So enough about us. Let's get into here what we're about today. So I'll hand you over to Anthony, and we'll get talking around Azure NetApp Files.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So Azure NetApp Files is a way that customers can look to address a few challenges, primarily performance, reliability, and management. For performance, Azure NetApp Files has 3 tiers to call upon. You have your standard, your premium, and your ultra tiers, and they have various performance levels between them. It is highly available. It is delivered to you as a service. There's no need to purchase any additional appliances or licenses to support this. It is delivered as part of your Azure consumption plan, and it is on demand. You can provision high performance storage in literally minutes, and all this is actually underpinned and delivered using NetApp's ONTAP technology, which is delivered as a service. Azure NetApp Files has a choice of protocols, NFS and SMB. It is extremely high performance storage with multiple tiers, as we just mentioned. And it is important to point out that this is a Microsoft first party service. It is billed as part of your Azure consumption plan. So again, as I said, no need to procure additional licenses to support this. Regarding the actual sizing of the solution, it's quite a simple calculation, which is your service level times volume quota will give you performance. The actual storage hierarchy, again, it's quite simple. You have your Azure subscription. Within your Azure subscription, you create your NetApp accounts. Within those accounts, you create capacity pools and you place your volumes within the capacity pool. So in this example here, we've got a NetApp account with a capacity pool at the premium storage tier, which gives you 64 megabytes per second of throughput per terabyte. Interestingly, you have to provision a minimum of 4 terabytes as the service is at the minute. And in this example, we have a 2 terabyte volume, which should give us performance, which will be on the next slide. So your capacity pool, which is a premium tier, 64 megabytes per second with a 2 terabyte volume, will give you, or should realize, a performance of 128 megabytes per second on that volume within that capacity pool.
And there's a multitude of ways to get your data into Azure NetApp Files, whether that's NFS or SMB. Majority, there is a native tool called CloudSync from NetApp that's available as part of the Azure NetApp File service, where you can connect the tool will connect to your source and destination file services or NFS volumes, and will replicate the data between those two and keeps them in sync throughout. Or you can use some more traditional tools. So if you're more familiar with Robocopy or rsync, then you can use those tools as well to sync the data into the service. At this time, there's no support for things like Azure Data Disk or anything like that, but potentially on the roadmap.
Yeah, the pricing, regarding pricing, standard, premium, and ultra. This is a representation as accurate at time of writing. Standard can be seen as comparable to what you would see as mainstream hard disk performance. Your premium tier could be compared to SSDs, right up to ultra, which would be comparable to all flash arrays. And as I mentioned, there is a minimum capacity commit of 4 terabytes across all these tiers at the minute.
And today the service is available across 12 separate regions. More importantly for us in the UK, that you can see UK South and UK West both listed there, and obviously North Europe, West Europe. So with an aggressive roadmap as well to deploy into more regions in the future.
There are various use cases currently available for you to look at within the NetApp Files literature. SAP being one of the biggest ones in a minute, the ability to host SAP binaries on high performance storage without the need to spin up expensive NFS clusters to support that. SQL databases also, as well as Oracle databases. Interestingly, Talon Solutions, this is a recent acquisition by NetApp, I think earlier this week. So Talon is basically a distributed file caching solution. Kubernetes, HPC, and of course replacement of traditional file services.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting use case around the SQL database one. Something that we've been working on quite a lot. SQL clustering inside of Azure is always been pretty difficult unless you wanted to build a storage spaces direct cluster, or you wanted to build always on availability groups. So a use case that we're certainly looking to use more and more at the moment is using an SMB share provided by Azure NetApp Files to provide sort of failover cluster instances of SQL services, which is another option of availability to make your database services highly available within Azure, all backed by Azure NetApp Files, which a lot of our customers are seeing a lot of benefits from at the moment.
Yeah, so in summary, Azure NetApp Files gives you high performance storage. It is deployed on demand. Interestingly, it can be accessed via REST API. So for instance, there is a way to generate snapshots, and there's an interesting GitHub project which Kirk Ryan has published about how you can leverage a logic app to automate the generation of snapshots. It covers 3 tiers, as we mentioned: standard, premium, and ultra. It can be dynamically adjusted. It's secure and highly available. It's part of the Microsoft ecosystem, and it does have an extremely long and feature-rich roadmap.
So hopefully that's given you a good overview of Azure NetApp Files as the service that it is. Infrastructure as code is obviously a hot topic in a lot of arenas at the moment, and is becoming sort of the new must-have. Azure NetApp Files actually supports both ARM templates and Terraform. And firstly, this is a really important statement around infrastructure as code, that it's actually, you can treat your infrastructure the same way as you treat your software and your application code. So as I mentioned there, Azure NetApp Files supports ARM templates and Terraform, and you can create all 3 required components from there. So your Azure NetApp Files account, your capacity pool, your SMB or NFS volume. And also, one of the benefits of Azure NetApp Files is that it's natively integrated with Active Directory or Heritage Active Directory, Legacy Active Directory, whatever you want to call it. So you can take advantage of your groups and users and your NTFS permissions and share permissions as you normally would with file shares. An interesting point at the moment that the Terraform provider for Azure NetApp Files doesn't actually support the creation of SMB volumes. However, there's an open PR from the Microsoft team that I'm watching closely that should be published and merged into the master branch within the next couple of weeks that will release support for that. So let's get into what it actually looks like. So if I dive into VS Code and we look here, here I've got an ARM template that contains all of the required settings that I need to deploy my Azure NetApp Files account, a virtual network, peering it to a virtual network that has Active Directory present within it, creating my capacity pool, and then creating a volume off the back of this. So let's get that created in the background. So here's one I made earlier. And let's pop in a password for my Active Directory connection. Okay, and while that's running in the background, let's go and take a look at Terraform. So as a lot of you are probably using today, Terraform is a lot easier to read and understand for getting started on that infrastructure as code journey. And as you can see here, exactly the same. So we can create our Azure NetApp account here. We can provide all the various parameters and variables. All of this is documented within the Terraform provider documentation on their website. The same for ARM as well. It's all fully documented about what's required and whether it's a string or array and the values that you need to enter there. We can then create our capacity pool and provide the relevant details there. One thing to note in Terraform that it actually takes the size in terabytes compared to the ARM template that wants it in bytes. So if we look at the ARM template version of this, that's 4 terabytes in bytes. So yeah, it's a little bit different, but again, one of the benefits of using Terraform. And then creating our volume here, this is actually going to create an NFS volume and link it to the relevant subnet. But you know, as I said at the beginning, the support for SMB volumes is very, very close. So let's dive into the Azure portal and see how that deployment's getting on. So if I look inside this resource group where it should be deploying, we click in here, refresh. Great, there we can see. So we've got our ANF account, and with the relevant names that is specified in the template, it's created the Active Directory connection as we specified in the template. Create a capacity pool 4 terabytes on the standard tier. Should be creating a volume as we speak. So yeah, it's still in the creating stage, and that's just linking it up to AD at the moment and provisioning the required computer accounts behind my domain controller. But as you can see, a really easy way to just create all of your Azure NetApp Files deployments, but from an infrastructure as code perspective. So whether you're not there yet and you want to use it, so you absolutely can. But if you've got DevOps pipelines and you're using the DevOps mentality to manage your infrastructure in Azure, you can absolutely use that to deploy your Azure NetApp Files deployment as well. Let's just see if that's going to map really quickly. If it wants to finish, I can map it. Okay, that is going to take some time, so we'll come back to that in a second. So a use case that we actually didn't mention on the previous slides was Windows Virtual Desktop, which obviously, again, is a very, very hot topic within the Microsoft Azure space, and especially now with the recent news and what's going on in the world. So it's typical an RDS deployment, but as a service. So instead of you having to deploy all of that infrastructure from gateways, brokers, load balancers, and SQL databases to support that RDS style environment, that's all provided to you as a service. It's delivered. Can deliver a Windows 10 multi-session experience, which is the only place to deploy Windows 10 multi-session at the moment is within Azure. It's got built-in optimizations for Office 365 Pro Plus, so all of that performance is really, really performant and customized heavily for a Windows Virtual Desktop environment. You can migrate your existing Windows Server remote desktops and apps into Azure as well. So if you want to just publish an app, you absolutely can still do that with Windows Virtual Desktop. And as it's built on the Azure platform, it's highly scalable and customizable within minutes. Really by putting it in Azure, you get access to all the security features from Azure itself. So Microsoft invests more than $1 billion a year on cybersecurity research and development. They've actually just building a new center in Dublin to also add to this. They've got 3,500 security experts today that are constantly looking at the Azure platform and making sure that it's compliant with all the various certifications out there, like the Cloud Security Alliance and ISO, and all of the different various requirements that are out there. And it's got more certifications than any other public cloud platform as well. Obviously, Security Center as well is a big part of Azure's message in the security space. And because Windows Virtual Desktop backs off to that service, but it's built upon Azure, you get access to that service for all your Windows Virtual Desktop machines as well. So a bit of a breakdown on how Windows Virtual Desktop is consumed and built. So these are your clients. So whether it's a HTML5 browser, there's a Windows app, there's a Mac app, there's apps for the iPhone and Android. You can connect from all of these devices into the Windows Virtual Desktop service, obviously behind your firewall. And then this is the Windows Virtual Desktop that is provided as a service to you by Microsoft. So the broker, the web access, gateway, the Azure SQL, and all the diagnostics and logging is provided to you as a service, where you would have to build that before in a typical RDS deployment or a Citrix style deployment. Obviously, that is protected again and firewalled off. And then what you deploy is your Windows Virtual Desktops or the apps, so the desktops where those apps are living. You provide Active Directory to it and FSLogix. And FSLogix is the really key part. That's now free and included as part of the Microsoft licensing. But storing those profile containers, as many of you will know, is the absolute key part to a successful deployment of any virtual desktop environment. Obviously, using Azure NetApp Files is a reference architecture for this now, and is highly performant to be able to deliver those profiles really quickly to make that login experience, which is the only experience that your users will worry about, as performant and as making your users as happy as possible for that login experience. And all of that there is hosted within Azure, but the only bits that you have to worry about are obviously just the top pieces. So from a connectivity perspective, Windows Virtual Desktop, first of all, you need to authenticate with Active Directory. Once your users have authenticated with Active Directory, they pass that token into the web access portal for Windows Virtual Desktop. Once they select the relevant application or desktop they want, the token is then passed from there, and they can connect to the desktop from their device. And that's brokered through the broker service and the gateway service back to your end users.
Yeah, as Jack's already mentioned, a recent acquisition by Microsoft was as the FSLogix solution, and this is a great way to essentially manage user profile containers and Office containers as well. You can use it for application masking, so you might have session hosts with multiple applications installed, but you might only want users to see certain applications, and also it's a great way to manage Java version control. Okay, I'm going to attempt to take control now, Jack, so I can actually do a demonstration of basically the Azure NetApp Files service in conjunction with Windows Virtual Desktop. So I'm just going to try and take control. Hopefully you can see my screen okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. So here I am in the Azure portal. I'm just going to jump into my Azure NetApp Files account. So within an Azure NetApp Files account, you can configure, for instance, your Active Directory connections. This is what gives you the access to leverage NTFS permissions within the service itself. You also create your capacity pools. So you create your capacity pools where you set your performance tier. In this case, I have a 4 terabyte capacity pool running at the premium level. Within that capacity pool, I have some volumes already pre-created in a true blue piece of fashion. Here's some I created earlier. We have a file share, which is essentially our user file shares. And we also have a volume for hosting our FSLogix containers for user profile management. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive in and log into the Windows Virtual Desktop portal. Just going to connect my phone to show this. What I'm going to try and demonstrate all as part of this is passwordless authentication. So hopefully you will be able to see my screen. So I'm going to log in here. Oh, I'm going to cancel that. Sorry about that. So when I click login, I've got my user account here. Now, because I have passwordless authentication on, I get a notification here on my phone using the Azure Authenticator app to actually verify my authentication. I simply match the number with the number which has been presented to me on the phone, and there we are. I'm now logged in. So this is actually using the HTML5 client. As Jack mentioned previously, you can get clients for both iOS, Android, Mac and Windows. I've got some applications presented here from my Windows Active Directory tenant. I also have a desktop session. So you can present applications from within one host pool and desktop sessions from within another. You can't present both from within the same host pool. So this demonstration, I'm going to log in to my session. So this is a session host running in the Windows Virtual Desktop platform. This is actually running an NVIDIA-backed GPU machine. I have to log in. Unfortunately, single sign-on is only enabled via ADFS, which we don't have running at the minute. Oops.
Yeah, an important note while Anthony's logging in there, the double sign-in piece is hot on the list of the Windows Virtual Desktop team to resolve, and I understand that it will be coming very, very soon.
Yeah. Okay, so there I am. So I'm now logged into my host. It's important to note this is, as I said, through a HTML5 browser. It's a relatively performant. What I've got here now is I've got my shares mapped. So this is a map drive within my host. I've got some files in here. Now, for instance, we talked about snapshots earlier. So if I just hop back into this volume here, I can show you that I've already created some snapshots of this volume. These snapshots can be created manually or they can be automated using the REST API. So with snapshots created, I can, for instance, come into this file here and say I will delete it now. So that file's now gone. Because this integrates with previous versions, I can actually go back now to restore my previous versions. Here I have the snapshots available for me to select. I double click on this, I copy this file. Oh, that's not working. Give me a second. I open my previous versions. I take a copy of that file. I can return to the directory from where it was wanted to be, and I can simply paste it back in. So that's actually quite a powerful solution, especially for some of the customers who don't want to be reliant on restoring files based on user requests. You can actually delegate this ability to your own users. Okay, Jack, shall I hand back to you now?
Sure. Just share that back. Great, and hopefully you can all see that. Okay, so moving on. So that was just a brief overview there of Anthony's Windows Virtual Desktop environment that was backed by ANF. Also important to note that that was across a VNet peer as well. So the Azure NetApp Files deployment was actually hosted in another VNet, and that was peered into the Windows Virtual Desktop VNet that Anthony has with his domain controllers and with his other resources within. So it does support VNet peering. It also can be accessed over ExpressRoute. So yeah, it's very flexible at the moment in terms of the networking space. So Windows Virtual Desktop comes included in all of these license SKUs that you can see on the screen. So most of the Microsoft 365 stack, as well as the individual Windows 10 Office Office 365 SKUs that you can buy. That also includes the FSLogix licensing as well, and customers with any RDS cows for 2012 R2 and newer actually get entitled to use Windows Virtual Desktop as the RDS based version, so not a Windows 10 multi-session desktop, but a Server 2019 or Server 2016 session host. You're entitled to use that, your RDS cows against that, as long as they've got software assurance alongside them. And as I just mentioned, that you're entitled to the FSLogix licensing due to a recent acquisition by Microsoft as well, that will give you access to the FSLogix profiling container tool, the Office 365 container tooling as well, which is really important. So your users who are connecting to services like OneDrive and SharePoint and syncing those directories locally back to their machine. Obviously, a big challenge in a virtual environment or a virtual desktop environment is making sure that that data isn't re-downloaded every time they log into a different host. By still using FSLogix, all of those application data paths are rewritten to be written to a profile container and an Office 365 container, and backing that off to Azure NetApp Files is the reference architecture, as we mentioned before, to make that highly performant and highly available to your virtual desktop environment.
Yeah, here's a pricing example. So essentially, these are the core services to support what we're talking about here. We've got Windows Virtual Desktop, Azure NetApp Files, and also a Microsoft 365 E3 licenses. As Jack mentioned, in those licensing SKUs, you get benefits to use the VDA license. So actually, on a per user per month cost, this actually does become quite a compelling solution. So due to the demand that we're seeing around Windows Virtual Desktop, the interest that customers are showing in this, we've actually built at CDW a proof of value around Windows Virtual Desktop, which is underpinned using Azure NetApp Files. This is essentially an off-the-shelf package. It's a very limited engagement. So, for instance, this will create a Windows Virtual Desktop tenant, a maximum of 2 host pools. It will we'll also build the session images and generate publication for both desktop and applications. There are some constraints around this. We're limited to this a maximum of 25 users, only going to be using Windows 10 multi-session with 3 applications and authentication delivered using Azure Active Directory domain services, unless you as a customer have Windows Active Directory functioning within your Azure environment and it is accessible. If you are interested in this, please do reach out to your account managers for any more information, and we'd happily engage with you.
Yeah, and we're seeing an awful lot of uptake on that one, right, Anthony? I think me and you are probably working on sort of 10 to 20 opportunities for this at the moment.
Yeah, indeed, and it's only growing. I think obviously Windows Virtual Desktop, in all honesty, is in its infancy, but as with most things that Microsoft are working on within the Azure public cloud space, it is growing at an exponential rate with some huge amount of improvements coming soon. For instance, a nice management blade within the Azure portal.
Yeah, just to really summarize Windows Virtual Desktop as a service then. So it really is RDS as a service or VDI as a service. So you can have pooled or personal desktops. So if you need that dedicated desktop for specific users, you can absolutely achieve that as well. Again, it's a first party service and Microsoft are responsible for all of it. So all your support and all your billing is through your Azure subscription and your Microsoft licensing. Azure is the only place that you can run a Windows 10 multi-session desktop at the moment. So another great reason to run your VDI solution within Azure. You're likely also to already have access to those licenses. So a lot of businesses are moving to the Microsoft 365 licensing SKUs. And by doing that, they're automatically getting access to this service. So it may be a good way to reduce licensing costs for virtual desktop services by consolidating them. And hosting your FSLogix profile containers on Azure NetApp Files is by far the best experience, and we've done some extensive testing on that and can confirm that it is super performant when you put it in Azure NetApp Files compared to the other options. And as Anthony just mentioned, the roadmap for Windows Virtual Desktop is super aggressive, and we're getting releases sort of bi-weekly at the moment, and it's forever growing and more features are being added sort of as requested by the community. So that's really our overview of Windows Virtual Desktop and Azure NetApp Files, and a couple of demos in there for you as well. We like to open up the floor to some questions. So if you want to reach out on the chat window, then that's absolutely fine. Or if you want to take yourself off mute and ask the questions, then we're happy to answer any questions around either Windows Virtual Desktop or Azure NetApp Files. We've actually got a question in the chat window already. So from Mike, and the question is really pertinent actually. So the question is Microsoft still offering Azure Files, or is Azure NetApp Files replacing this? I think that's a really good question, and some testing that we've done recently, Anthony, but it's absolutely not a replacement. They're both still going to exist. They both have their use cases. Some of you may have seen in the news recently that Azure Files now supports native Active Directory authentication, which Azure NetApp Files has done since its birth. We've actually done some testing recently, Anthony, right?
Yeah, we've carried out a bit of testing, and primarily really around performance, to get a good idea or a good handle on what Azure Files will give reverse to Azure NetApp Files. I think Jack, you'll agree that initially the main read performance from Azure Files was relatively impressive.
Absolutely.
But the consistency of the Azure NetApp file solution was far more capable, I say, in the sequential read writes delivered across the various tests. So price point, Azure Files does come out slightly cheaper. So I think for workloads which do not necessarily require that intensive performance, it might be an option, but absolutely where high performance is a requirement, Azure NetApp Files is possibly the best solution there is.
Yeah, and I think that just to reconfirm that point with the data that we saw around sort of random read writes to different sectors of the disks, sort of file share, Azure NetApp Files was super consistent in what you provisioned is what you got in terms of the quota and performance, as the calculation on the slides we went through earlier. Whereas Azure Files was quite good for sequential reads, but when you got into the random read write access, it was at least sort of an eighth slower.
Yeah, it was quite noticeably slower actually. Yeah.
So interesting there. We've got another question in the chat here around the quality of Skype, Teams audio and video through Windows Virtual Desktop. So great question. So it's not actually publicly available yet. Audio redirection sort of works in Windows Virtual Desktop, but it's not fully supported. There's a redevelopment of the Teams client going on. As soon as that is published, then all of these problems will go away, and it'll be available. So at the moment, the only way to deploy Teams in a Windows Virtual Desktop environment is actually using Citrix to layer over the top of it. But again, we can help you with any of those requirements that you've got out there.
This is Mike Mendoza. I have another question.
Of course.
Yeah. So you mentioned early on deploying with ARM and Terraform. So what's the primary reason for that? Is it for configuration drift, to prevent configuration drift? For those who are not inclined with, or not are familiar with infrastructure as code or not trained in, how would they be able to deploy the NetApp files?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and you can absolutely deploy Azure NetApp Files through the portal, and I can flick very quickly back into my demo environment here. So if we were to dive back into my resource group, hopefully you can still see the screen there, Mike. So we've got an ANF account here, but if I wanted to create another one, I can literally click Add. If I could look for Azure NetApp Files, get that provisioned. An important thing to note that I think we may have missed is at the moment the Azure NetApp File service is a whitelist only service, so you could get to this screen, but you may not be able to hit the create button if your subscriptions aren't whitelisted by the Microsoft team. Again, if you're looking to use the service, then come and speak to us. We have direct access and direct contact to the guys at NetApp and Microsoft, and we can get those subscriptions whitelisted for you and work with you to make sure that your experience is successful and you get the most out of the trial. But you could create whatever you liked here, fill out the form, and that would create your ANF account. Once you've got that ANF account, you can create your capacity pool from within. So I can click and add a pool. Let's call it Cap Pool 2. And let's put that on the premium and say 4. As Anthony mentioned, if I put that on, say, 2 terabytes, it tells you it has to be between 4 and 500. So if I put it on 4 and click OK, and it's really that simple to get going. So if any of you have had to deploy Azure NetApp file, sorry, a NetApp before, racking and stacking it and configuring all those things. You can see a lot of that's been taken away by using Azure NetApp Files. And once we've got that capacity pool provisioned, which looks like it's completed, I go into there, I can see the volumes, and I can go, actually, do you know what? I want a new volume. Let's call it volume 3. Give it a quota of 200 gig. Pop it in the correct VNet. Review next and protocol, so I can choose between NFS and SMB there. Click SMB. Choose the relevant subnet, what share name I want it to appear as in its Active Directory. Add some tags if I want to, and then I can click create. And that's it. Off it goes and create. So it's absolutely available to all managed through the portal. If you're not familiar with infrastructure as code or ARM or Terraform or any of those offerings, I think a lot of people are certainly moving towards more of a world where they're staying away from the portal and using more things like ARM and Terraform to control those exact things in terms of permissions. So the only thing that has permissions to create or deploy anything within your Azure environment is a service principal and a DevOps pipeline, and everything's treated as code. So you would treat your applications and software as code. You start treating your infrastructure as code as well and manage it in the same ways with Git source control and all of those best practices around that. Does that answer your question there, Mike?
Yeah, it does. Thanks. So basically, you're leveraging the source control, like you said, to be able to recreate the deployment without having to manually configure everything. I guess it really helps with bulk deployments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have templates internally. So when a customer wants to come along and they want to deploy something, we use a template and we fill out customer variables, what subnet is going to go in, instead of us having to rewrite a template every time or slightly rework it every time we need to do it. We just fill in a couple of variables and off it goes. So we're making things reusable at scale.
Gotcha. And I imagine that template can also be gotten right from Azure, right? Usually the templates or the code is there for you to use.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if we dive into Azure NetApp Files here, and I was to go and find that there, I can see here's my NetApp account, and if I click export template, it's all there for you to go and use. So that's a good way of adopting it if you're not too familiar on how to write it from start. Deploy it in the portal, click export template. You can download that as a zip file, and you can get started from there and customize the bits and pieces that you need.
Perfect. That answers my question. Thank you.
Great. Have we got any more questions out there that anybody would like to ask in the chat window, or come off mute and ask those questions?
Kurt just asked, is this a marketplace offering?
Yeah, I've seen that. I've ignored on purpose. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, we'll bring this.
Since no one asked, since I have room, the pricing for this and how it's priced. I looked at the document before that quickly. It was not totally intuitive. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the pricing for this. I know it's part of your subscription. It's available to you, but then depending on your usage and the amount of data that you're consuming, how this gets priced exactly?
Yeah, I mean, this is priced at the various tiers. Jack's put some indicative costs here. These are priced in sterling, so British pounds. And you basically pay for, so you can create your NetApp account, and as soon as you create your capacity pool, that is where you're going to be billed from. So for instance, as Jack has mentioned, the minimum you need to commit to initially is 4 terabytes. So as an example, 4 terabytes at the standard tier hosted in the UK region at the minute is approximately £450 per month. Whether you are using a gigabyte or 4 terabytes, it's still £450 per month for that capacity pool. And obviously it goes up in terabyte increments after that.
And I think
so you basically you're paying for what's provisioned.
Yes, you're paying for provision storage. Yes.
Yeah, and I think really another important factor to go into this is you don't pay for read and write requests. So if you were to spin up a disk or a storage account within Azure, you'd pay per the operations that you perform on that storage account or disk. With Azure NetApp Files, you only pay for what you provision in terms of storage, so you don't pay read and write costs on top of that.
Okay, got it. That was my next question. That's what you anticipated.
I knew where you were going.
Thank you.
Great. Are there any more questions out there from anybody? Okay, well, I'll take that as a no. If there are any questions or anything like that, then feel free to get in touch with the events team, and they can fire them through to us, or get in touch with myself or Anthony via our contact details that were listed at the beginning, and we'll happily answer those questions. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it's a bit of a weird and wonderful time with events being cancelled left, right, and centre, but hopefully the webinar's been useful for you. And yeah, any of those opportunities that you want to come and speak to us about, then feel free to get in touch. Some useful links here just for your reference if you want to go and look into anything further.
Okay. And when will the recording and will the deck be available as well? Or
yeah, I'll imagine both will be available. So give us probably to the end of the week with the recordings to go through sort of some auditing and some processing, and then we'll get that all published out via the relevant channels.
yeah, especially the deck, so that we'd be able to use it here and show it to the folk who are interested in looking at this.
Absolutely, we'll take that on, and we'll speak with the events team and see what we can do.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for your time, and have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks very much.